Good morning, students. I hope you are staying in your place and you are absolutely healthy and fine. Uh, in my last presentation, I've explained or given the summary and analysis along with the important quotes of the volume 1. The volume 1 has been completed. Now we are moving to volume 2, and today I will try to cover the first few chapters of volume 2. This entire presentation contains the summary, analysis, and important quotes of chapter 1 to 7, but um, it is actually class presentation, so the video usually will be long. The presentation will be long, so I decided to split it up. I will try to cover the first three chapters in this presentation, and the next uh, chapters in the next presentation, so that I might keep the video a bit short. So without wasting any time, let's move to the presentation. So here are the important lines we have. One of the comment is made by Jane Bennett, another one is Elizabeth Bennett, and please excuse me, this one is, the third one is made by Mr. Bennett. The T is missing over here. So they are discussing about something over here. He may live in my memory as the most amiable man. It is said by Jane Bennett, and there are a few people whom I really love and still fear of whom I think well. This is about, this is said by Elizabeth Bennett. And next to being married, a girl like to be crossed in love, a little known, it is said by Mr. Bennett. So the summary looks like this. The Caroline Bingley, you are familiar with this name, Caroline Bingley. She is the sister of Bingley, Mr. Bingley, Charles Bingley. So Bingley will certainly be gone for a while, and everyone is delighted with Darcy's sister, Georgiana. So actually, Caroline is providing a hint that they are not interested, or they are losing interested about the Bennet sisters. Rather, they are focusing about, or rather, they are focusing on Georgina, who is actually Darcy's sister. Please check the character mapping. You will find that Darcy has a sister. Her name is Georgina Darcy. Jane tries to put on a brave face. Jane is in love with Bingley, so she is not comfortable with this idea that Bingley is moving on. So Elizabeth, telling Elizabeth that Bingley has not wronged her and refusing to believe that Caroline has ulterior motives. Elizabeth tried to convince her elder sister that whatever is going on, it is because of Caroline, but Jane didn't believe that. So then Caroline writes back, and the next page is, Elizabeth is disgusted that Bingley could be so weak to let her sisters and friend determine his affections. So Elizabeth is really disgusted because she considered that if someone is in love, then why he should listen to somebody else's preferences. She cites him and Charlotte as example of human inconsistency. But Jane tells Elizabeth she judges them too harshly. So this is something Elizabeth is doing frequently. She is a judgmental character. She always tries to judge people from her own standpoint. And Jane actually said this, that she judges them too harshly regarding Charlotte and regarding Bingley also. Wickham occasionally visit. Wickham is playing his role. He is trying to impress Elizabeth and helps to dispel the gloom. Mr. Bennet encourages Elizabeth in her pursuit of Wickham. So Mr. Bennet somehow he understands that there is a chemistry between Elizabeth and might be a chemistry between Elizabeth and Wickham. That's why he says, well, you can pursue that one. And the analysis looks like this. Jane again insists on seeing only the bright side. Jane is, we can consider Jane as an optimistic character, denying even her own heart feelings. Even when she is hurt, she still try to look the brighter aspect. It's the opposite of prejudice, but it makes her just as blind as the prejudice Elizabeth. Now, if someone is like Jane and behaving like Jane, then we might consider that character as blind also, because she is also driven by her own prejudice and her own system, like Elizabeth. Elizabeth complains that Bingley can't direct her own true feelings. Well, um Elizabeth didn't try to understand that being a social animal, human beings are often um, influenced by the company with he or she is actually moving on. Now, she didn't realize that she is complaining. This is ironic since Elizabeth's affections and prejudice are being guided by Wickham's sharp lies. Yes, Wickham is actually manipulating the mindset of Elizabeth. That can be clearly seen. Mr. Bennet continually fails to understand what will be good for his daughters. Mr. Bennet is like that. If you like, we can go ahead and that. He even didn't realize that Wickham could be, or Wickham is actually a villainous character. Now, in the chapter 2 of volume 2, we see that I never saw a more promising inclination he was going. This is said by Elizabeth Bennet. And the summary looks like this. Mr. Collins leaves again, and Mrs. Bennet's brother and wife, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, arrive for a visit. Please check these two characters. If you will find those names in the character map. Mr. Gardiner is a tradesman in London. Mrs. Gardiner is intelligent and extremely well liked by Jane and Elizabeth. Yeah. After listening sympathetically to Mrs. Bennet's outpouring of complaints, Mrs. Gardiner speaks with Elizabeth about Jane's situation. Jane is disturbed. She is uncomfortable in her situation. So Mrs. Gardiner speaks with Elizabeth about Jane's situation, what's going on in her mind. Elizabeth confirms that Jane was very much in love and swears that Bingley's departure was no accident. So Jane loved to believe that Bingley's departure is actually an accident, but Elizabeth is not ready to accept that. Mrs. Gardiner proposes that Jane come stay with them in London to help her recovery. Yeah, this often happens. If any disastrous incident happens, any personal loss or things like unhappy instances happens in our life, we like to move to different places for a change. Now, Mrs. Gardiner did the exact thing for Jane. She invites Jane to stay in London. Mrs. Gardiner promises that Jane and Bingley are not likely to meet. Elizabeth secretly hopes that Jane's presence nearby will rekindle Bingley's affection, because somehow she is confident that Bingley has some sort of feelings for Jane. So she is actually right, and Elizabeth wishes that the nearby presence of Jane might change the mind of Bingley. Now, analysis looks like this. The Gardiner represents the established middle class. This is, yes, it was important. Their presence, they are not only character, but also they also represents the middle class people. They are lowly family connection that might hurt the Bennet sisters' prospects of marrying well. Mrs. Gardiner takes the place of Mrs. Bennet in soothing and restoring the family. She represents a stronger, sympathetic, and more sensible mother figure for the girls, which Mrs. Bennet is not. Because of their class, the Gardiners live in a very different part of town and travel in different social circles that Bingley and his family and friends. So, Miss Gardiners are actually middle class people, and they live in a different circle of people. And Bingley and his family friends, they live in a different circle of people. That's very common. We have our circle in our life. We have our friends, we have our family members, near and dear ones, according to our interest, according to our financial conditions, according to our professionals, like that, isn't it? Now, in the chapter 3, this one will be the last chapter in this presentation. So, important lines we have here. It is said by Elizabeth Bennet. I can see I am not in love with Mr. Wickham, though she is saying so, but somehow she is influenced by Mr. Wickham. So let's move to the summary. Having noticed the work between Elizabeth and Wickham, Mrs. Gardiner also cautions Elizabeth about making an unpromising match, warning that Wickham has no fortune. So Mrs. Gardiner is very practical, and she warns Elizabeth that this relationship with Wickham doesn't go anywhere. Elizabeth can only promise that she won't rush into anything. Yeah, she made promise that I will not rush. I will not do anything drastic. Mr. Collins returns for his marriage to Charlotte before they leave. Charlotte makes Elizabeth agree to come visit. Yeah. Finally, Charlotte and Mr. Collins, they're getting married, and Charlotte invites Elizabeth to visit her place. Once he is gone, Charlotte writes to Elizabeth frequently about her excellent situation with Mr. Collins, but Elizabeth has her doubts. So there has been a letter, I told you earlier, a lot of letters used in this particular novel. Sometimes it is a epistolary novel also. Now, this one also, Charlotte, in writing, present Elizabeth a picture that how happy she is, how excellent situation she is living with Mr. Collins. But Elizabeth is still it's doubting. She is unable to accept this theory. How is it possible? Now then, Jane travels to Gardner's to London and writes a letter to Elizabeth. And as planned earlier, Jane already travels to London. She says that she wrote to Caroline but received no reply, and then visited Caroline but was coldly received. Now this was already warned. Jane was already warned by Elizabeth earlier that Caroline is playing a vicious role here. See here that Jane wrote a letter to Caroline but received no reply. And then when she personally visited her, she was coldly received, like, you are unwanted, you are not welcome here. Now 4 weeks have passed and Jane has heard nothing from Bingley, and when Caroline finally paid her a return visit, she was again exceedingly cold. Now this is a custom. This is a social system. If you visit someone, then it is there should be a return visit also. Caroline when visited Jane, again she was very cold. So, summary: around the time Wickham's interest shifts from Elizabeth to a young woman who recently inherited £10,000. Now, this is the actual character of Wickham. Wickham suddenly found someone, a young woman actually, who recently inherited £10,000. So his primary focus is actually money. That's why, in this from this novel for your university exam, you can prepare that money marriage thing, that how money is playing a very important or significant role in this novel. So Elizabeth finds she isn't affected much by losing Wickham's attention. Elizabeth has some feeling, but it was not that kind of deep or serious. So when she found that Wickham is not showing any affection or is not attending her, she doesn't feel very much. She realized that she was never in love with him and misses him well. Well, that's the point. Analysis: Mrs. Gardner recognizes the hard reality of needing to marry into a secure situation. Elizabeth is not convinced and still is focused mainly on finding love. So, Mrs. Gardner, she suggested something about Mr. Wickham, not to marry Wickham or do anything quickly that will devastate Elizabeth's future. Also, Elizabeth still she is convinced, or rather, she is focused mainly on finding love. Elizabeth thinks that anyone who gives up the hope of love in exchange for stability, particularly with a fool like Collins, can be anything but miserable. She is still unhappy with the decision of Charlotte. That's why there's been a reference to Collins here. Now, Caroline knows that Jane and Bingley, if they saw each other, would rekindle the spark. This is Elizabeth clearly visualized these things. She already observed the chemistry between Jane and Bingley. That's why she is quite confident. If they meet with each other, then there might be some probability of some good news. So, while being careful to conform to the niceties of high-class social interaction, she at the same time does everything she can to discourage and degenerate Jane. A double standard: Elizabeth judged Charlotte harshly for marrying for money, but excuses Wickham for seeking a fortune in marriage. Now, this is a typical thing, I must say, that Charlotte was hardly criticized because she married Collins for money, but on the contrary, when Wickham found someone with a brighter future, or rather better financial option, she excuses weekend. But she's not excusing Charlotte for that. So that's the end of this presentation. The next chapters from chapter 4 to 7 will be covered in the next presentation. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share my channel if you think I'm doing it properly. Thank you again. Stay home, stay safe.